Hello and welcome to the ninth episode of the Connect the Dots NYC podcast. I'm your host, Vedant Vohra, and I am so excited to take you on this journey as we explore different solutions to homelessness. As the creator of the CTD NYC app, I've seen how technology can connect people to vital resources. CTD NYC helps individuals experiencing homelessness in New York City access shelters, food, and healthcare, bridging the gap between them and essential services. It's a powerful example of innovation meeting compassion to tackle the homelessness crisis. Each episode, we dive into stories, strategies, and innovations from those on the front lines, whether they're advocates, policymakers, service providers, or individuals with lived experience. My goal is to spark meaningful conversations and shine a light on the incredible work being done to make housing more accessible for everyone. Thank you for joining me today, and let's get started. Our guest today is Dr. Sam Tsemberis. Dr. Sam Tsemberis is a clinical psychologist and the founder of the Pathways Housing First Institute. He's best known as the originator of the Housing First model, a groundbreaking, evidence-based approach that provides immediate access to permanent housing without preconditions like sobriety or treatment compliance. Since launching the first Pathways to Housing program in New York City in 1992, Dr. Tsemberis has helped expand the model nationally and internationally, including in Canada, Europe, Australia, and South America. In 2015, he founded the Pathways Housing First Institute to provide training and implementation support to cities, agencies, and governments worldwide. Housing First has proven remarkably effective. Studies show it leads to housing stability rates of over 80%, compared to around 40% for traditional programs. In 2024, Dr. Tsemberis was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. He currently serves as Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry at UCLA and Executive Director of the UCLA VA Center of Excellence on Veterans Homelessness. He's also the author of Housing First, Ending Homelessness, Transforming Systems, and Changing Lives, and has received numerous honors, including the APA's Distinguished Contribution Award and Canada's Meritorious Service Cross. Welcome, Dr. Tsemberis.
Nice to be with you.
So I want to start with your origins and early insight. And so you began as the director of Project HELP in New York City. What did you see in those early outreach days that told you something had to change?
Well, Project HELP was an emergency outreach team for New York City. It was really started by the mayor at the time, Mayor Ed Koch, which I think sets a precedent of where effective interventions need to happen at a municipal level. The mayor's office is the only place where all providers can go and agree upon working in a particular direction. And so they do play a pivotal role. Ed Koch was very upset because people were on the streets of New York City and freezing to death, or they were trying to get out of the cold and go down into the subway systems and were getting hit by trains in the tunnels as they tried to, get off the platform so they wouldn't get arrested and get into more sort of hidden areas of the stations. I mean, it was not good what was going on. And so they started this Project HELP program. It was an acronym for the Homeless Emergency Liaison Project. And this program was basically a psychiatrist, a social worker, or a psychologist like myself, and a nurse, and we would drive around the city in a van. It was almost like a psychiatric emergency room on wheels, if you will. And we would get calls from the other outreach teams because the whole city knew about Project HELP. It was the city's emergency squad for homelessness. So there were lots of other programs throughout the boroughs. So if somebody would identify somebody who was homeless and seriously mentally ill to the point that they didn't know what was good for them, that they might freeze to death, or that they looked particularly vulnerable because they maybe had a physical illness, or they were wandering in traffic, anyway, they would call us and we would go and assess the person. The assessment was to figure out, are they oriented? Do they know what's going on? When did they last eat? Are they dressed for this weather? And if the person appeared very disoriented, we had the authority. Project HELP was the only team in the city that had the authority to call the police and bring the person to Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital involuntarily if necessary, because we thought they weren't going to make it, even if they disagreed, even if they disagreed. So it was a very controversial program because, on the representation of the client's point of view, we were violating their civil rights and, making decisions for them that they wouldn't make for themselves. So it was fascinating, as a program and the issues that came up with that. And we were doing that, I worked there for about 4 or 5 years, saw hundreds and hundreds of people that I think we saved some lives for sure by bringing people to the hospital. And then some people also got housing. We never saw those people again because once in the emergency room and everything worked out all right, they were home. But what we did see was the people that went to the emergency room, stayed for a few days, or went into the hospital and stayed for a few weeks, and then they were back out on the street again. And we began to really get to know people that were doing this repetition, and there was quite a lot of them. And for that group of people, there was no other option. They were not willing to take medication. They didn't acknowledge that they had a mental illness. If they were using or drinking, it wasn't a big deal for them. That wasn't their main issue. They were on the street. It kind of helped them to relax from all of the tension of being homeless. They wanted a place to live, but they didn't want to have treatment as a condition for getting into housing. And all that there was at that time, I'm talking about late 80s, early 90s, like almost 40 years ago, all there was, and, oh, and by the way, this is not history. The same thing is true today. There are many programs that require sobriety and psychiatric treatment as a condition for giving somebody who's homeless a place to live. So we needed to do something different. We were stuck. But Project Help was a controversial, interesting program, saved some lives, still has a purpose in our society. There are people still out there that need to be brought in involuntarily because they won't make it. So we need that. But that's like solving an emergency, of a person who has mental illness and is homeless. It's not really solving the problem of homelessness. And it's often not solving the problem of mental illness either. It's a band-aid.
And what was the moment or person that led you to believe housing could come first without preconditions?
Oh, for me, that wasn't a particular decision. Like, I think it was so many different conversations with people who were homeless, where people would explain their lives to me, and we'd be sitting there saying, shouldn't you go to the hospital? You're not doing well. Like, he said, yeah, but I've had mental illness since I was like in my early 20s. This is a 60-year-old man, let's say I'm talking to. So I know what mental illness is. I've had it all my life. My problem is not mental illness. You know, well, what about the drinking? I see you're still drinking. Yeah, I've been drinking since high school. Like this is, I know what drinking does and I know what problems it has. What I need is a place to live. This other stuff I don't need. Or people would say, the that there just wasn't the other people would not even acknowledge that they had a mental illness. They were doing well in terms of like survival on the streets. They had their stuff. They knew where it was safe. They knew where to get food, at the food soup kitchens. But they believed like they couldn't really sign any papers or um, participate in anything run by the government because the government was surveying them, you know. Well, 30 years later, we know actually the government is surveying everybody, but these people were ahead of their time. but they were not willing to see that as a kind of a psychiatric problem. And so they wouldn't, they were like locked in their own thought pattern that precluded them participating in a program in a way that would get them admitted. So they continued to remain on the streets. So somewhere all of these experiences, it's like, in talking them over with my colleagues also, it's like, Rod, what are we going to do? Says, well, like the only thing that we can do is like everybody wants a place to live, so we'll just get a place to live. There was money at the State Office of Mental Health for programs called supported housing, so we can get money for rent and then case management services, which is basically a social worker that would visit the person once they're housed. And well, it was not ideal, and it seemed very high risk to take somebody from the street because they don't look like they're going to be okay in an apartment by themselves. People on the street look sometimes either very vulnerable, like they're going to need a lot of help, or sometimes they look a little scary, like what are they going to do when they're in there? But it doesn't exactly conjure up the image of a living room with a couch and a TV, like they could just go from that to that. But that was the only thing that people wanted and would say, I would do that. I would participate in a program like that. So without knowing if it would work or not and having quite a bit of trepidation, we tried it. We got money from the government. We got money for 50 apartments. The initial program was 50 units. And we started going to the people that we knew on the street and said, well, you said you wanted a place. We'll help you, And I can't tell you. I mean, I think about a lot of experiences I've had, but the joy of somebody going into their own apartment for the first time after they've been on the streets for a while is indescribable, Vedant. It's um, just to be near it, just to be kind of like in the aura of that kind of gratitude and joy and relief, and I would talk to people after they were in their apartment for a while. And it's like, what's it like? What's the difference? And it's like, oh, to be able to sleep without people telling you when to sleep and when to wake up, like you do in the shelter systems. Because I could remember my dreams and I could lie in bed thinking about my dreams instead of having to get my stuff and get out. To be able to watch whatever television channel I wanted to rather than the one the program has for you, turn up the volume or turn down the volume, or just that, like you realize when somebody's homeless or in one of those like shelters or congregate places, they have almost zero control over their environment. I mean, other than like getting a drink of water or going to the bathroom, like everything else is controlled for them. They experience this complete sense of they don't know where their next meal's coming from or who's going to give it or how long it's going to last. It's like this incredible state of helplessness and dread. So just the simple fact of having a place to live that's secure, that's yours, is an enormous help, healing. And at the end of that first year, when we had housed people, we saw that 84% of them had stayed housed. People that you would not believe could actually get off the sidewalk and even find their way to an apartment were not only in their apartment cooking their own meals and living a decent life, but they weren't going anywhere. They weren't wandering around. They didn't, they still had their issues, and we were there to help them. It was always a requirement that you accepted that we have to visit you. That was the only program part. You have to sign a lease and pay 30% of your income towards the rent because that's the way the contract was set up. So if people had a disability income, they would pay that, or if they had welfare. Most had a disability because we chose people with severe mental illness, so disability was part of it. That also gave them the Medicare, so they can get treatment and medications. And you had to agree that we're going to visit you. So it's like 84%. Wow. Like, when we were taking people involuntarily to the hospital, we only had like a 30% success rate of getting people housed. It's like, this is something. We knew we were onto something.
And 84%, I mean, I'm sure is very high number in terms of statistics. Like you were comparing it with the 30% of involuntary hospitalization. And so what I want to ask is, it must not have been that easy. And so did people think you were unrealistic when you first proposed housing first? And how did you navigate that pushback?
I was so excited by the data. I wanted to tell everybody. It's like, hey, we can do something like really good, and quick. And I thought people would say, really? Tell us all about it. But that's not what happened. People are like, bullshit. There's no way. You must be taking like the nicest or the easiest people off the street, and that's why it's so successful. In fact, just the opposite was true. We would take people like, oh, you have a severe mental illness? Well, of course, I mean, because we were being funded by the Department of Mental Health, so everyone had to have a severe mental illness. Well, when you have addiction, okay, that was true for about 80% of people. Oh, and you have like a history of arrest, okay, now, and you have trauma, and you have, no one else, no one in your family. That's the person, the person that had the least possibility of getting housed were the people that we would purposefully seek out to house. And when I went to tell people about it, they thought we were creaming. We were like doing the opposite, taking the easiest people. Then they didn't believe our diagnoses were accurate. And they didn't believe that, they really had the kind of addiction that their people had, because there's no way that their people could do what our people were doing. People were very, very, very reluctant to accept it at face value. Um, I, you know, so I thought, how did I handle that? You know, I said, we got to do research. You have to show in an empirical way that this program works. Like we have to kind of do a randomized clinical trial. And we wrote a research grant to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration to house 225 people who were homeless, mentally ill, and addicted from the streets. Half of them would be randomly assigned to the Housing First program, and the other half would go to, shelter. You have to get clean and sober and treatment to get into housing. And it was a 3-year study. And so we began to do that. I remember one of our collaborators was at NYU, Beth Shin. And so we hosted a meeting of providers downtown around the NYU area saying, hey, we got money to do this study. We have 100 apartments we can give away. We need you to refer people that have all of these conditions. And people were like, we're not referring anybody to your program. It's irresponsible to put someone like that in an apartment. They're going to burn the building down. They're going to hurt, I wouldn't do that to my client. I wouldn't. So we had to go like find our own people from the street and recruit them into the study. And, the study, that was the one we published in the American Journal of Public Health. That was the 80-something% success housing first, 40-something in treatment as usual. And I think that helped to get people to think about it in a more rational, like the science was there. And then also by that time, I had also gone to Washington, D.C. and started a program there because one of the things people would say was, that's New York, like New York's got a lot of benefits. New York's got a lot of housing. You could only do this in New York. It wouldn't work anywhere else. So there was not only the demonstration that it works, like from a scientific perspective, but it's got to work, it's got to have the generalizability. It's got to work somewhere else too. So I was motivated to go to DC and start a program there, which is still there running today, Pathways DC, very good program. Subsequently, I started a program in Philadelphia, not because I wanted to, the mayor really wanted. Now, it went from this won't work anywhere else to can you come and do it here? Can you come and do it here? So I opened one in Philadelphia, and then I also opened one in Vermont because I was curious to see if this model would work in a rural setting. Because in a rural setting, I was curious because when we rented an apartment in New York City, it's such a big city, the landlord doesn't know the person they're renting to. They don't know that they could be from a program, or they have a history of homelessness. But in Vermont, where there's like a town of, Montpelier, 12,000 people, everybody knows everybody. And I wanted to know if the landlords would in fact rent to people who were homeless. Like, would the proximity of a rural setting undermine the applicability of the model? I was curious to study that. Anyway, the thing is that when you do the program well, it works very, very well in all of these places. And by 2010, 15, I guess 15 now, people were calling us, and that's why I started the Institute. Like, can you come tell us how to do it here? Come tell us how to do it here. Come like that. So it became, that was the trajectory.
And I now want to focus, on that housing first, immeasurable success. And when you have that immeasurable success, you obviously have to, continuously implement this generalizable, product, as you had mentioned. But what are some of these non-negotiable principles that define the housing first approach that you've kept at the heart of the program and the institute?
The non-negotiable principles I would call the program fidelity standards. Like, one of the things that happened with all of this enthusiasm about Housing First is that people started to call all kinds of programs Housing First. And so, because it was catchy, like everybody wanted to be doing Housing First, because my program does Housing First, because there's an evidence base. But your program is a shelter. you know, yeah, but we listen to people like they do in Housing First programs. Well, that's a good start. That's a good start, but that's not really all that it takes. You need to have, for sure, a client-directed program that you're listening to people, and that goes even to the very heart of what we're calling Housing First, because we didn't call this program Housing First. We call it the Independent Living Consumer Preference Model. It wasn't quite as catchy, but it actually is more accurate for what the program does. We would do whatever the consumer wanted. If they wanted haircuts, it would be haircuts first. If they wanted sobriety, we would take them to a detox first. If they wanted psychiatric treatment, if they wanted shoes, whatever it was. But inevitably, like 99% of the time, people say, I want a place to live first. I want a house first. So it became Housing First, not because we thought it was a good idea, but because that's what the person wants. And that's so fundamental to the program, because once they're housed, they still get the same question asked. What do we do now? Do you want to go grocery shopping, or do you want to call your family that hasn't seen you for like years? Like you tell us. The client drives the program, and why that's very, very important from a psychological perspective is that we're not making people jump through hoops. We're inviting people to define their own journey. That's a very different experience of being in a program that's encouraging you to think for yourself what it is you want. That actually is the way to recovery. So the recovery is built into the very foundation of the program. It's not a compliance program. It's a recovery oriented program. That's harm reduction has to be part of it, because you cannot operate this program if you're going to require sobriety or treatment or anything else as a condition of housing. The housing has to be permanent. It's not temporary. It's not 1 year of rent, then you got to figure it out. The services have to be either directly provided, or you the provider, take responsibility for connecting the person to all the services they need. It's not just housing and good luck. It's like housing and what do we do after you're housed, and all of those services have to be either directly available or brokered through whatever services are available in the community. Those are some of the main dimensions. There's a no discharge policy, that 15% that doesn't do well, we don't give up on them. You lose your apartment doesn't mean you lose the program. We'll help you find something that's more amenable to where you can live successfully, if you can't live on your own. So we don't, or if you get arrested, people get arrested. People are still using, they get busted. They get snagged in some raid, I mean, things happen. But if you go to jail for a while, we'll hold the apartment, you come back home, so there's no discharge. So these are some of the features that are absolutely non-negotiable. If you're going to run a housing first program, we can guarantee you'll get an 80% success rate, but you won't get it if you're not doing it this way.
Yeah, and I really like how you spoke to the difference between, your program, which is, at the core of it is permanent supportive housing versus generally what is implemented in society nowadays, which is more transitional housing where you're
Yes.
jumping between shelters. And so, on that note of permanent supportive housing, how that's rising in popularity, I wanted to focus on this huge impact that Housing First has had. And so, one of my first questions is actually, what country or city surprised you most in how quickly and effectively they adopted Housing First?
That's a good question. Um, well, I would say my favorite example, my current favorite example. I don't know about like first. I mean, people. It's been a journey. It's been a journey in the way that people have adopted this, and like for the Maori in New Zealand, or for the Cree and the Sioux in Winnipeg, Canada. Just like all of those kinds of like people coming to homelessness and even to Western values from a completely different perspective, and fundamental to this program is this idea of our like profoundly human values of self-determination, dignity, housing as a basic human right rather than something that has to be earned. Those kind of core values resonate internationally. That's been a beautiful thing to sort of see in practice. One of my favorite example right now, I would say, is Milwaukee, because Milwaukee was a city, is a city, still doing it today. The Milwaukee Housing First has done an amazing job. What they did was they had the mayor and the county executive work together to adopt the Housing First approach, not as a program, but as a city. So that meant that at the mayor's table, the United Way was there, the shelters were there, the district attorney was there, the police was there, the downtown business improvement district was there, like the community. And they all decided they're going to do this thing. The housing authority had enough vouchers for the people on the street. There were like 320 people on the streets of Milwaukee. And they had this team, and they would begin to give people a voucher. The police would not arrest people. They would call the Housing First team. The business community would not call the police. They would call the Housing First team. And then it began to get a momentum. It's like, oh yeah, oh, this person, they want a house. They have a voucher. They had these vouchers in Milwaukee. But if you had a felony arrest, you disqualified from public housing. So the district attorney expunged people's records who were given citations and violations while they were homeless. So there was like record expungement to get people in. So it's like everybody in the community was like, and they would have monthly meetings with the metrics. They saw the numbers going down. The United Way invested money to get another caseworker. The business community invested money to get their own outreach person that they could call directly and have. Um, the landlords, of course, were involved. So to me, that took the Housing First program to a whole other level of implementation, like as a policy at an urban, city level, and how well developed and well orchestrated it was. In 3 years, they brought the number, I think it was like 324 down to 17. And I remember because the HUD, which is the National Housing and Urban Development Organization that counts homelessness, Milwaukee had the lowest number of people who were chronically homeless of any city that size, that particular year. So it was an innovation, kind of a step up in taking the principles and applying them beyond the immediate homeless service system to the wider community, and to see how these things were adapted collectively.
And I mean, you just mentioned the importance of community in your example of Milwaukee, and previously you've also talked about the kind of core principles that make sure that housing first is truly housing first. But on an international scale, how do you ensure fidelity to the model when it's being scaled and adapted to different local circumstances?
Well, I mean, I think that this has become a kind of a movement in a way. I mean, there's, for example, Housing First Europe, which I was involved with that, wrote basically took the manual, wrote a man. This thing is well manualized, right? I wrote a manual for it. The people in Europe took the manual, translated to the many different languages. There's a Housing First Europe hub. Canadians, same thing. There's a Housing First network. We have something called the Housing First Partners Conference here in North America. We're launching the European Housing First Partners Conference in Berlin just in this November. So that I think that over the years the program has been pretty well understood, and and the conversations about fidelity and drift from fidelity and effectiveness and staying true to the model continue to be um, part of the conversation today.
And I want to focus onto the challenges that Housing First has faced. Like I had mentioned earlier, you obviously faced challenges when trying to first create this model, and not everyone was, interested to jump on the train. But currently, what's the biggest misconception about Housing First that you still hear today, and what's your usual response?
Well, there's a couple of misconceptions. I mean, the most frequent one is that we tried it here and it doesn't work. And then when you look into we tried Housing First here, it doesn't work. And you look at what it was that they were calling Housing First. It was an apartment building with 20 or 30 units. They put everybody in that building that had, history of homelessness and addiction and mental illness. Now, all this conversation we've been having, when I'm saying we look for an apartment, we're looking for an apartment that's like next door to your apartment or my apartment. It's like, you know, places are affordable, but it's not a program. We're just renting from private landlords. So now, in the interest of like efficiency, people rent a whole building and they put everybody in there, and they have very little case management. There is a ratio beyond which case management is ineffective. You can't have one case manager for 30 people that are high need. It's like, there's no service. And then so everybody's like wheeling and dealing and buying from each other, getting high together. Police are called. The whole thing's a disaster. They shut it down. Okay. That's one kind of thing that happens. And it's like, oh, Housing First, we tried that. It didn't work. Well, it wasn't Housing First. The other is going on right now with more of the Enterprise Foundation and the Cicero Group, the right-wing think tanks don't like Housing First. I'm not sure why they don't like it, because it actually ends homelessness pretty effectively. But I think they're looking to cut government funding. Everything is about cutting government funding. So You don't want to pay for someone's rent permanent, or the kinds of services they need. Probably much cheaper to keep them all in a congregate setting in a shelter. And so they're pushing for shelter and treatment, sobriety, and even employment before we'll give someone housing, which is like an impossible bar for the people we're talking about. But that's their push, and their justification is, well, if housing first works so well, why do we still have homeless people? You know, so it's a kind of a sleight of hand argument to make a point of trying to push the system in a different direction. Which in this country, I'm afraid they might succeed because everything is going kind of south in this country pretty fast. So I don't know what's going to happen to the housing first stuff, but they've had quite a few papers and they write op-eds in the newspapers. Housing first doesn't work because we still have homelessness. Um, it's 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 uh, it's not only disingenuous, it's also not fact-based, because housing first does work, but we haven't solved homelessness. That's another issue, though. We haven't solved homelessness because we're creating homelessness faster than we're ending it, you know. And this gets to Zoran's campaign, and this whole idea about the rents. And the rents have increased in this country in general, and in New York City and Los Angeles much more so, but at least 325%. And minimum wage has increased barely 10 or 15%, right? So the rents are way out of control. And if people even working on minimum wage, let alone being on disabilities, if they're on disabilities, it's a fixed income. So if somebody loses their housing because the person they were staying with dies or moves away or the building is gentrified, once you're homeless, there's no way back in. You're priced out of that market because you can't get a month's rent and a month's security to get back in. So I remember there was a director here in Los Angeles who left her job. She was upset by the financial issues. And she described the fact that in Los Angeles, they were housing across, it's a Los Angeles County is 13 million people. I guess it's like about, anyway, 13 million people. They were housing 207 people a day, but 227 were showing up asking for homeless services. So, the thing about this, and this is a very important thing most people don't realize, homelessness is not a pool of people. It's a stream. Like there's a lot of homeless services and a lot of homeless people. A lot of people are getting housed in the existing system. They may be staying 30% of the time or 80% of the time, but they're getting housed. And why do we still have homelessness and the numbers are growing? Because the rents are still unaffordable and the money that people get is not enough to be able to keep them housed. So they're falling out of housing.
I now want to move on to, some your role more personally, which is, a clinical psychologist. And so as a clinical psychologist, how do you see the relationship between housing and recovery, mental, emotional, physical recovery? How is that, connection, how is that played out?
Housing provides psychological support in and of itself, just sort of as a structure that some people have called like an ontological security. Like you don't have to worry about your safety. You don't have to worry about where you're going to sleep tonight. You have a place. You belong there. It's profoundly healing to a sense of the anxiety and the fear and everything insecurity that happens if you don't have a place to live. But recovery, all the way to recovery means somebody has let's say schizophrenia or bipolar, which millions of people do. But just like having diabetes or a heart condition, you see a doctor, you take medication, and you have a life. There are people with schizophrenia that are teaching, driving Ubers, working in restaurants, doing landscaping. I mean, just like everybody else. So in order to get to that level of recovery from homelessness, you need support and understanding of what the illness is and how to take care of it, and encouragement to participate in the treatment to healing, or to having your best life under those conditions. But you're not going to have those conversations if you don't have a place to live. You need the house as a foundation to build the rest of recovery on.
And you've had this great journey from, a clinical psychologist to, making obviously Housing First Institute to recently being named Times 2024 list of the 100 most influential people in the world. What does that recognition mean to you personally, but also just for the field in general?
Uh, you know, I mean, I'm a little out of it that way. I got a call. I guess it was last year. I don't remember, like January or something. And this person said, "Oh, my name is Kate Matthews. I'm from Time Magazine." I'm like, "I used to read Time, but I don't read." I thought she was selling me a subscription. So she was the person doing the recruiting. I think they had like a list of people that are eligible candidates, and they go through that. What I felt. I felt great. I mean, I thought that, as someone who's like represents Housing First, and to have Housing First or recognized at that level can only be good for the movement. It's like, because usually, there's a lot of talk about Housing First, but it's in psychiatric services, the European Journal on Homelessness, like well known in a very small. This is like Time, man. Time is like real world. It's like, hey, we broke through. We're mainstream. It was great. I was up there with like Asia Wilson. I was like, does it get better than this?
And with all the success you've had, you are one of the, most perfect people to ask this next and last question. If you could send one message to the next generation of advocates, what would
Mm.
it
Vedant, is that how you pronounce your name?
be? Yeah.
Vedant, I have to say, because I have children of my own, and I have to say that, to me, you represent the hope for the planet. I don't want to put a lot of pressure on you, but we've had our work, but I think that if you have the kinds of values and intelligence and creativity and entrepreneurship, I think that if we're going to turn things around and make this a better place, my hope is that more people more people do what you're doing.
Well, thank you so much for your kind words, but also your time and, just the general, experience that you've had to share. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for reaching out. I have to tell you, I've been interviewed quite a bit, and you, sir, are an excellent interviewer.
Thank you so much.